Okay, well, I think for tonight, the audience might want to know that I was head of and am head of the American Anti-Slavery Group, and that's our topic for tonight. I found out that blacks were enslaved in Africa, and nobody seemed to care. And I started a movement, and it was mostly about Sudan and Mauritania. And that's what I'll be talking about tonight. In addition to that, I have been a pro-Israel activist. I head, as you noted, the Americans for Peace and Tolerance, and we fight ideological enemies of America and American Jews. And right now, like everybody else who is in our orbit, we're fighting critical race theory, and things like that. So, but let's stick to the topic. I have to tell you, Annie, there have been some new developments in the anti-slavery movement since we last spoke, and I'll get to them later. But if I can begin, I first want to make some preliminary remarks about the practice of slavery. So I just published an article called Arabs and Muslims Have Black Slaves and the Progressives Don't Care. Slavery is a human institution. Everyone watching tonight should know that every civilization had slaves. Practically every civilization has had slaves. Jews had slaves, Christians had slaves, Muslims and Hindus had slaves, whites had slaves, blacks certainly had slaves, Chinese had slaves, Persians, and the Roman Empire was built upon capturing of peoples and making them slaves. So slavery is not a white sin. Slavery is a human sin. And the only moral comparison about it is this: which cultures got rid of slavery and which cultures did not? So we know a lot about the appalling American slave trade that involved Europe and the United States. And we know when it started and when it ended. And the transatlantic slave trade started in the middle of the 15th century and it ended in the late 1800s. There are even good estimates as to how many slaves were taken to Europe and America from Africa, about 11 million men, women, and children. And how many died on the voyage to America and how they were treated. And we know that the active importation of slaves from Africa to the West lasted for over a century. But what we don't know, and what we're not taught in school, is about the other 11 million Africans, men, women, and children who were taken into slavery by Arabs and Muslims, slaves taken into the vast Arab Muslim world in a trade that started more than 1,000 years before the Western sin, and the trade that continues today with little or no notice and with no apologies, no guilt, no talk of reparations, nothing, no admission. So the Arab slave trade originated before Islam. Arab traders took Africans across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean from places like present-day Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and elsewhere in East Africa, and they brought them to what is now Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Somalia, Turkey, and other parts of the Middle East and South Asia, mainly Pakistan and India. So Arabs supplied African slaves to the entire Muslim world, which at its peak stretched over 3 continents, from the Atlantic to the Far East. Okay. There has been an endless flow of books and articles written to enrich our knowledge about the Western slave trade, while the issue of Islamic slaving has been all but ignored. Western feminists, right, turn away from women abused in the Muslim world. Then there's politics. You know, today the left embraces Muslim populations here as victims of Western racism. And so they're the allies of the left. And so why would the left taint their allies with talk about jihad slaves? I mean, imagine Black Lives Matter, you know, rallies all of the people on the left, the Latinos, the women, the gays, the transgenders, and the Muslims. Well, that would be a little bit hard if people knew that those very Muslims that are coming to support Black Lives Matter haven't said a damn word about freeing Black slaves today from Muslim masters. It's a little tricky. So, and then fourthly, there's fear. There's the fear of being smeared as Islamophobic, as you and I and everybody who speaks the truth will be smeared, because it's not about racism against Arabs. It's about a war of ideas. Okay. One might have hoped that there would have been abolitionists in the Arab world who would have written about the Arab Islamic slave trade. But unlike in the West, there is no moral opprobrium in the Islamic world attached to the enslavement of people, since it's sanctioned in the Quran. And the Quran, many say, is unchangeable forever. So how could there be guilt about something that is sanctioned by Allah in the minds of probably most of the Muslim population? Slavery was an integral part of Arab society, and there's simply no guilt about this there. And to the extent that the Arab nations abolished slavery, it was due to Western pressure, not to an internal cultural rethinking or guilt or a broader vision of what is humanity. And that's why it still endures, and it endures. So now I need to tell you a little bit about my own fight against jihad slavery that began in the 1990s, when I found that you could buy and sell Black people in Sudan and Mauritania for about $40. And I was shocked. I was a human rights person. I was a civil rights person. I marched with Blacks. I went to the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech march, the Million Man March. And when I found that today, on our watch, you could buy and sell Black people in Africa and nobody cared about it, I was shocked and confused, and I have to say angry, and I got determined. I read about it in The Economist magazine. It was a short little article. I mean, why was it a short little article on page 47 when to me it was like glaring headlines about the Black trade, the trade in Black flesh in North Africa. So I was a good activist. I fought against I marched against apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid's really, really terrible, but slavery is maybe 100 times worse. And yet nobody was marching in the streets. Nobody was having anti-slavery conferences. Nobody was boycotting Sudan and Mauritania. There was no BDS against Blacks being made slaves by these people. So I thought hard and long about how to change that. And one of the first things I did was I searched for and I found the diaspora populations of Sudan and Mauritania in America, in New York City. And I met them and I asked them, tell me about the slavery. And the Sudanese told me, look, there's a war in Sudan. There is a holy war. We didn't know what jihad was back in the 1990s. There was a religious war against Black Christians, and they've killed more than 2 million of us. And yes, they take slaves. And nobody cares about their killing of us because, compassion fatigue. Americans really aren't interested in, Africans killing Africans and what goes on there. And even these people were killed and enslaved because they were Christians. They really didn't have much of a foothold in the Christian world in America either. So my job was to convince them that even though murder is worse than slavery, logically, psychologically, Americans are going to listen if you talk about and if you explain that there are Black women and children and some men being enslaved today, because we are an abolitionist nation. We disagree about everything, very important things, abortion, gay rights, et cetera, but about one man owning another, we don't disagree. In fact, that is probably the core of an American identity. all men are created equal. That was the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's the basis of America. And that's why Abraham Lincoln was able to fight a civil war to free the slaves, because of those fundamental principles of America. And so we should talk about that. And I won them over to that, and we created an alliance between the Mauritanians and the Sudanese and good abolitionist people, Jews, Christians, and others. So in Sudan, what was happening was that there was a jihad. Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, was ruled by an Islamist party, and it sent Arab militias to storm Christian villages in the south. They shot the men because the slavery, and I'll explain that, the slavery in this part of the world is not about musculature. It's not about picking cotton or tobacco. It's not about plantations. It's about conquest and concubinage. It's about spreading the babies of the jihad makers throughout the world through the womb of the captive women. That's what it's about. So they shot most of the men. Over 2 million had been killed. The Christians actually in America who were picking this up came to call it, this was the silent Holocaust. Nobody cared. 2 million people were killed. So I was able to put them together. The big breakthrough came when I co-authored a piece in the New York Times that broke the story about the enslavement of blacks in North Africa. My partner was Mohammed Atiye. He was a Mauritanian Muslim, and I'll tell you why about him in a minute. And we launched with that piece. I mean, we got hundreds of phone calls about that piece. Let's do something about this. This was that America in the 1990s. Let's do something about this. We don't care who's doing it. We don't care. We just care that we got to stop this. And it was wonderful. So we started the American Anti-Slavery Group, and we got tons of media. We got radio, television interviews, press all over. Black leaders joined us. Left and right joined us. Now, this may not be possible today anymore because the country is so divided over everything, but we'll see because we're rekindling this. Okay, we had the NAACP and we had the Christian right. We had Pat Robertson and then we had Barney Frank. I mean, we couldn't put them in the same room, but they were both signed on to stopping the enslavement of blacks. And then I met the most heroic people. These were a group called Christian Solidarity International, CSI, a man named John Eibner, who is a saint. He's a heroic figure. He flew into Sudan during the war so many times. He figured out how to liberate the slaves for cash. And it's a long story. We can get to that in the Q&A. We helped him raise money for that. CSI freed tens of thousands of slaves. My group helped. Louis Farrakhan attacked us. This is very interesting, especially to fans of David Horowitz. Why would Louis Farrakhan attack us? Well, think about it. His job, his mission, paid for, by the way, in great part by Islamists and Arabists, by Gaddafi. In fact, Gaddafi loaned him $5 million, and President Bill Clinton had to stop that. And it was about, building a black Muslim revolt against America. That's what that was about. But anyway, his job, Farrakhan's job, is to convince black Americans that Islam is the path to freedom. Well, reports about slavery of blacks done by Muslims in Africa, all over Africa, is not going to do him much good. So he attacked us. I was called a Zionist Jew, which to him is a curse, to me is a blessing. We got serious phone call threats. We got serious other kind of threats. I'm writing a book about this. It should be published a couple of months from now, I hope. A lot of bad stuff was going on. And then he was humiliated. Farrakhan was humiliated when he challenged the press corps at a press conference in Washington, D.C. about the enslavement. He denied that there were black slaves in Sudan. And he said to the press corps, if you think they're slaves, go to Sudan and find them. So two reporters from the Baltimore Sun went with John Eibner, and they redeemed several slaves. And when they came back, there was a 5-part series, front page. Hey, Minister Farrakhan, here they are. There are black. What are you going to say? And he disappeared. He ran away. He's from this issue. Now he's come back. If you haven't noticed, he's back. You ever hear of critical race theory? That's, according to Mark Levin, Farrakhanism in curricular format. So anyway, long story short, the Christian South the Christian South was armed by Israel. Now that was a secret for a long time, but it was leaked. It's been leaked. And Israel armed the Christian South so that they could, the SPLA, Southern People's Liberation Army, Sudan People's Liberation Army, was able to liberate itself by their own bravery and fighting they fought the armed might of the Arab Muslim world. It was an amazing story, and it's been not really told. And they did it with our help as well, because in the year 2005, I think, George W. Bush, the president, who heard about Sudan and through his church, we had many people in the Christian church really furious about what was going on. People enslaved because they were Christians, being massacred because they were Christians. And Bush got it. He forced the North to accept a plebiscite, a vote by the South about whether they wanted to stay as part of Sudan or whether they wanted to divide. So guess what? 99.999% voted to leave. So South Sudan became the world's newest nation because of, in some significant part, I have to say, the anti-slavery movement, the anti-slavery campaign. And when I met the first president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, I showed him the New York Times article that broke the story that launched the anti-slavery movement and sparked, I believe, the birth of his country.